All right, so I'm going to be picking up on our Game Lab game where we left off last Tuesday. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to recap a little bit since last Tuesday was the first day that we actually used Game Lab. Turn this off while I'm presenting there. So I will go through a little bit of some of what we did last class. And the first part of what we're going to be doing is actually going to be kind of reviewing a little bit of what we did and going through some of the similar steps in order to add an enemy to our game. All right, so if you want to follow along, make sure you're logged in. I know there've been, now that we're kind of getting the hang of things a little bit, used to coding a little bit more, people have been able to follow along as I'm instructing a little better. So I've been watching the projects and some people have been getting stuff done in class and then you don't even have any homework to work on later. Or like, you get it most of the way done. You're like, okay, I don't understand this part. And then you got like 2 questions and then you're done. So if you're feeling confident, you may want to try that so you don't have to go back and rewatch and follow along later, at least not entirely. All right, so as I say, first I'm going to go over some of the things we did last week and some of those differences again between Game Lab and App Lab. So first big difference you can see in the fact that we have a code mode and an animation mode, right? App Lab, we have that design mode. Animation mode is where we bring in our images. It doesn't give us as many full featured options as design mode, right? We can't actually physically move things around on the screen where we want to put them. But later down the road, there's more stuff we can do with animation that's pretty cool. So it's just kind of something that's a little bit different, right? This is where we're going to go to bring in any graphics we use in our game need to be loaded in through here, right? So we've got our player ship. I got my background I used. We're going to be bringing a couple other things in here a little bit later. Okay, so that's the first big difference. Right. Some of our categories we're going to see are very different too, right? So for example, on world, we have a lot of different commands here that we did not see in App Lab. In fact, we haven't looked at most of these yet. Really, the only one in this side of things that we used was draw sprites and key down, right? And key down was nice. That was like another one of those differences, right? A lot of the code we're seeing, it'll do similar stuff, but there's just slightly different way to do it in Game Lab. And actually, most of the time, the way that we do it in Game Lab tends to be a little bit easier than how it was in App Lab. Some of our other categories of commands, how our things are grouped in our toolbox are a little bit different. So we've got this sprites category, which we used a lot and we're going to be using a lot more of. So remember, the sprites is kind of one of those big vocabulary words you may or may not have heard before. And a sprite is just any 2D graphic used in a game. So anytime you hear that word sprite, talking about 2D graphics, not 3D full featured ones, not like if we're playing Call of Duty or something like that. Those we wouldn't refer to as sprites. Sprites are 2D graphics. It's like the ones we're using in Game Lab here. And these are all the settings that have to do with our sprites. Obviously, under this setting, we'll come back and revisit those in a little bit. Another new category over here in our toolbox was drawing. Now, looking at some of these, you could probably see some of the things you might be able to do in here that we didn't touch on, like draw a rectangle, right? But we use this specifically to add some text and to change how that text displayed. So really, we're looking at adding our lives counter up in the top corner is how we used the draw category last time, right? Now the code was right down here at the bottom. There's also this groups category, which we are not getting into yet. We will get into that next week. It may be getting a little confusing, but we'll worry about that when we get there. But it is kind of some pretty important stuff related to coding, but we're not there yet. Some of these other categories, we might see some different things or some things that were in App Lab that aren't here. So for example, under variables, we have far fewer options. That's a little cleaner, but we've got less options. We didn't use most of the other things that were available to us in App Lab under variables anyway, so But still, you'll see some small differences here and there. Okay. All right. Now the differences in how we actually assemble everything. We can think about how we added our sprites to our game, right? So when we add a sprite, which again is our 2D graphics, to our games, we had to create a variable that holds on to that sprite and actually creates that sprite for us, right? So for example, when I created my background, I had to use var bg equals create sprite, right? And this is giving it the coordinates of where to create that sprite at. In this case, 200, 200, which is dead center in the middle of my screen. Okay, and that's my X, and that's my Y. Just like in AppLab, our X and Y coordinates are set from the top corner. So 0, 0 is up here in the top left. X increases as I go to the right, so X gets bigger this way. Y gets bigger as I go down, just like in AppLab. Okay, so Y is 0 up here, but it gets bigger as I go down. It doesn't go negative. Negative is actually going the opposite way. Okay. If you go further in coding and you use different types of game engines or different platforms, you're going to see that sometimes different engines and platforms are going to do things differently with the coordinates, and you just have to figure out how each individual one uses their coordinates. This is how GameLab does it. Okay. So then again, that's our 200, 200. One other thing that was a little bit different here about our coordinates is when we get a coordinate for like a sprite, it is giving us the center of that. So if I get the X coordinate, it's giving me the middle of that sprite. It's giving me the X value of the middle of it. Whereas in AppLab, if I got the X value, it was giving me the far left edge. Okay, that's going to be important later on. Well, it's important now, but like we're going to specifically have to think about that a little bit harder later on. Same thing for my Y, right? It's going to give me the Y in the middle instead of AppLab, which gave me the Y value at the top of that object. Okay. So after we create our sprites, we do have to also set the animation to whatever image we are using for that sprite. And we also have this draw function. And this draw function is it's similar to our timed loop in AppLab. It's a little bit different. It's going to function a little differently, but it's similar to that in terms of like, this is the code that goes throughout our entire game. The code that's running the entire time our game is running. Right, so in that case, it is somewhat similar, right? So we created some code last time to make our ship move from right to left. What are you doing there? There it goes. From right to left. And another kind of big difference we saw was we get some of these handy commands we don't have before, like velocity X and velocity Y. Instead of having to manually set that X and Y coordinate, which is nice, although we can set it that way as well if we want to. Like I said, using our key down is a little bit easier in GameLab as well. We don't have to use the event with, it's a little bit easier to program, I think. A lot more built in functions into our GameLab. Okay. So that's pretty much all we did last time was added the ship, had it move right and left, and created our lives variable and showed it in the top corner. All right. So any questions before we move on to the new stuff today? Okay. So there is going to be a lot today. There is a lot of it's going to be using similar blocks over and over again, similar concepts, although there will be some new stuff mixed in there as well. So I want to make sure we're all fully on board before we move on. Okay. All right. So the goals today to add on to our project are we're going to add an enemy ship that's going to move, and when it collides with our player, we'll take away one of our lives and destroy the ship. Right. So it kind of like crashes into you and it explodes. Well, we won't have an animation for the explosion right now, but it'll crash into you. It'll be destroyed, and one of your lives will be taken away if that happens. So that'll be part one. Part two today is going to be creating the ability for your ship to then shoot at the enemy ship. Okay, so when we press the space bar, be able to shoot and have that blast destroy the enemy ship. So those are kind of like, we're going to be breaking this up into kind of two parts that are related to each other, but they are two different parts. So some of this is going to be related a lot to things we've started doing already in Game Lab. A lot of the concepts will be similar to things we did in App Lab. Okay, so I will be moving a little bit quicker, only because hopefully by now some of these concepts have started sinking in, and we'll be a little more comfortable with it today than maybe we were like semester one, right? Okay. So as I said, the first part we're going to do is work on our enemy ship. And in order to bring an enemy in, the first thing I got to do is figure out what graphic I'm going to use. So I'm going to go to animation. And I'm going to go to new animation to bring in a new graphic. And this is the graphic I'm going to use for my first enemy. And of course, again, as always, you can use whatever images you want. So you can use any of the pre-made ones here or upload your own. I am just going to search for ship and use one of the ships they have. I'm going to stick with this ship right here. Okay. And I click it, load it up. Looks like that. Oh, good. That's all I have to do in here. If I want to, I can, in fact, I probably will do this. I can rename it just so I can more easily find it later instead of being like ship 05_1. I'm like, what was that again? Right. So I'm going to call this enemy ship 1. Then I'm going to go back to my code. All right. Okay, so we're going to bring this into the game the same way I brought in our background sprite and our player sprite. So I'm going to initially, oh, actually, before I do this, this is going to be helpful for later. Before I actually bring the sprite in, I am going to add a comment in here, which we haven't done a lot of before, but it's actually really helpful to help you organize your code, because you can look at your code later and have a better idea of like what was happening where, right? So commenting is used both for your own purposes as a coder, be able to look at your own code and be able to remember what different parts of it did, as well as if other people are looking at your code, right? So our comments are under variables. We're going to go to it. I'm going to just add a comment. This is just like a note, right? This isn't code that runs. It's just a note. And I'm going to put it right below where I made my lives variable, but before my draw function. And I'm just going to call this section enemy setup. Below here, this is where I'll just put all my enemy code, so then I can more easily be like, okay, oh, there it is. All the stuff in here is my enemies. Because we're only going to have a few things in here today, but as time goes on, there's just going to be more and more stuff in here. It'll be helped to organize it a little bit. All right, so I got enemy setup. Now I'm going to go and be able to create my sprite. So I'm going to go back to sprites. And just like I did up here, I'm going to create a variable that holds onto that sprite, right? And gives it a coordinate. And I'm going to call this enemy1. I'm going to leave those coordinates alone for now. I'm going to come back and change them later after I actually see how things are being displayed a little bit. But then I need to actually set that animation, which is that second command block here under sprites. Enemy1. I'm going to set animation to my enemy ship 1. Okay. Now I'm going to hit run and just see how it's showing up. All right, that ship is enormous. It's huge. That's way bigger than I want it to be. So I'm going to change the size. And we did this with our player ship last week using this scale command. So I'm going to do sprite.scale. And again, this is under sprites. And I'm going to type in enemy1. So I'm doing enemy1 scale. And again, this is 1 is like 100% size. So as you go down decimals, it's going to get smaller and smaller. Or if you went up and did 2, it'd be 200% size, right? So since I've actually gone through this a few times before, both when I was testing this out and when I taught it last hour, so I already know what size I want to do. But you might, depending on which ship you use, you might need to test things out a little bit, check a few different sizes. I'm going with 20% size or 0.2. One thing I do want to note here that I don't think I mentioned last class. If I type in just 0.2, it will work, but it's going to give me this warning. Okay, and it's giving me this warning that says a leading decimal point can be confused with a dot. So this is kind of saying like, hey, you can do that, but you might want to do it a little bit differently. And what they mean by leading decimal point is that I put 0.2 instead of 0.2. And when they mean like the leading decimal can be confused with a dot, if you look at our command here that we used enemy1 dot scale. So that's why they're like, hey, you might want to put the 0 in front of there just so it's not confusing that this is a point and not a dot. Okay. So I'm going to put 0.2 and that error now goes away. It's going to run the same though. Right? Didn't break. That didn't really change how my code actually ran. All right, so I scaled it down, and I like that size. Again, if you use a different ship, your scale might be different, right? So like my player ship, I scaled at 75% instead of, and this one's 20%, right? So depending on what graphic you use, you might need to play around with your scale a little bit. All right, now I'm also going to need to rotate it because I can see my ship's kind of pointed to the side, and I want it pointed down. So I do have a rotation block here as well. Put it right underneath scale. And again, I'm changing this for enemy 1. And this one's pretty straightforward, right? I got it this way and I want to turn it that way. So I'm going to turn it 90 degrees. But again, if you use a different ship here or a different graphic, you might not need to rotate it at all. Set, hit run. All right, it's looking good. It's turned the way I want. This isn't even necessarily technically the front. I think it looks like the front because I think it looks like it's got little guns in the front. But if you wanted to use the other side in the front, you could turn it all the way around, right? It would be up to you. All right. So now I got my ship in there. It's rotated right now. I need to change its starting location because right now it's starting in the middle of the screen. It's too much in the middle. So I'm going to go back up to where I created that sprite, right? Var equals create sprite 200, 200. And these are my coordinates. Remember, 200, 200 is, well, it's my X and Y, but 200 and 200 is directly in the middle of my screen. Our game screen is 400 wide and 400 tall. So 200, 200 is directly in the middle. I do want it, I am going to leave it in the middle on my X, but I want to shift it closer to the top on my Y axis. So I'm going to come in here and test a few numbers out. I'm going to see what 100 looks like first. Okay, so now it's a little bit higher up. I want to go a little bit higher though still. 50. There we go. I like that one better. All right. So I'm thinking that looks pretty good. If I want, maybe I could maybe up it back even more. No. I'll leave it at 50. I'm going to leave it at 50. That's good. Okay, so I created my ship, gave it its animation, changed its scale, changed its rotation, but it's not doing anything, right? So I can move my, click in that window. I can move my player back and forth, right and left, but my enemy is just sitting there, not doing much. So let's give it some movement. So if you remember how I gave our player movement is we use this velocity. Specifically here we were changing our velocity X, which means our player, as we press our arrow keys, we were changing our ability to move on our X axis, our right and left arrow. Our enemy ship, we're going to add velocity on our Y because we want it to move down, right? We want to kind of move towards our player. So I'm going to add this velocity Y, and I am going to do this inside of this draw function, which again, it's kind of similar to how our timed loop was in our app lab. So I'm going to add this velocity Y, and I'm going to add it to the bottom of my draw loop, but make sure it's inside. So enemy 1. And velocity y, I want to give it velocity a positive y, because right, I want it to go higher up on my x-axis, which is actually down, right? I want the number to increase. I want it to move this way. So that's gonna be a positive number. And we'll try up 10. See how that looks. Yeah, right, maybe I think that's too fast. I could leave it at 10, maybe I'd do 5. It's not, as you can see, it's running into my player ship right now and nothing's happening. Actually, because I want to test it and be able to test it quickly, I am going to keep it pretty fast for now. Maybe I'll slow it down later, but I'm going to leave it at 10 for now. Okay. So now we got the player. We got our enemy ship in there. We gave it some movement, but it's not doing any damage to our ship, right? So if we were doing this the way we did it in AppLab, this is where we created our collision detection function, right? You had to tell where all of the edges of your objects were, and then check them to see if they were overlapping, right? That's how we did our collision detection function from scratch in AppLab. In GameLab, they have a few different ways of doing it, but it's gonna be much easier. It's gonna be kind of pre-built for us. So we'll look at some of those now. All right. So I am going to, to do this, so I am gonna still create a function for this. It's gonna be a much easier to understand function, I think, than the collision detection was. But I'm gonna make a new function just to kind of help organize it a little bit. So I'm gonna go to functions. And this is, one reason why we may want to use functions in our code is you can use functions both to organize it, kind of how I'm going to be doing it here, even though we might only run this function one time. Or you really want to definitely use them if you're running that code multiple times and reusing it the same way we did in our AppLab apps, right? Okay. In this case, I might only use run it once, but I think it's good to kind of help me organize everything together. So I'm going to go to function, I'll make a new one. And I'm using the first one. We are not going to have an input to this. There's no input, there's no parameter. Right? So I'm just going to use this first one. And I'm going to drag it, make sure it's all the way underneath that draw function. All the way underneath. And I'm just going to call this enemies collide. And all this is going to be checking is to see, or the code that's going to run when our enemy collides with our player. Right. Okay. So in order to do that, I'm going to need to use a conditional, right? So I'm going to see if something is happening. I'll go to control. I'm going to use if. And I'm going to use just this if by itself. It's not this one. We don't need an if else. So we're going to see if something is true, if our things are colliding, then run the code inside. And as I said, they make it a lot easier in GameLab than it is in AppLab. And they actually have a few kind of pre-built in functions that we could potentially use here. So I'm gonna go to sprites. I'm gonna scroll down a little bit here. And you could probably even just look at them and tell some of the ones maybe we'd want to use, right? So the first one is sprite is touching, right? So this sprite is touching target sprite number 2. Right? There's also collide here, right? So sprite.collide with this target. There's overlap, right? So there's display. So some of these sound kind of similar. We don't need to worry about all the differences in them right now. But the one that we are going to be using for a lot of these is actually is touching. So I know like we say collision detection, so you might want to go to collide. I actually tested it with collide and it worked a little funky. And we're going to just use is touching for this. So we'll say sprite is touching target. And we can actually drag this whole block inside of our condition that we're going to check with our if statement here. Or say if enemy 1 is touching player, then we know these things are colliding and what we want to happen. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to have when our enemy ship runs into our player, I'm going to have the enemy be destroyed. And they also have a handy dandy block for that. We scroll down a little bit further. We have sprite.destroy. I'm going to put that inside of my if block, and I am going to destroy enemy 1. Okay. Now, if I hit run right now, I'm going to have a problem. Anybody happen to notice what it is? If I hit run. Oh, no. Sorry, the 3D printer was having an issue there. So this function isn't running. That's my problem. So what I need to do is I actually need to tell it to run that code inside of the function, right? So same way we would have to run our functions inside of that timed loop, we're going to run our functions inside of our draw. So I'm going to go to functions, and I'm going to use the one to call a function or run it, right? Call a function means run the function. And I'm going to put it inside of my loop right underneath where I gave my enemy 1 velocity. And I'm going to make sure I type in the exact name of my function here. So enemies collide. And when I do that, I'll know I typed it in right, and I didn't make a typo because the warning went away here. Now, remember, this is a problem I saw some people have before. Make sure you match exactly the spelling, cases, everything, right? These two have to match entirely. As something I've pointed out over and over again, it was been in our Fix This App assignment, but those little typos, those little details matter. And the hint that something is wrong, right? So if I typed in, and please collide like that, is I have a yellow warning, right? That's a hint. Look at this line of code. I know I said this over and over, I've been saying this over and over all year, but sometimes still people looked at like the last assignment and they're like, well, I think I fixed it all. And I'm like, there's yellow warning signs all over the place, right? If you have this sign, that means it's not okay. It's not working. There's something wrong here, right? Read the errors, go with it. Okay? Make sure matching your spelling correctly, matching all the cases, 100%. All right, so we're going to run that enemies.collide function we just made, which is just this very simple function down here. I'm going to hit run. And now we can see when our enemy ran into our player, it destroyed the enemy, right? Disappeared. Right? That says destroy, it's not going to like do, an explosion or anything yet, although we could add that if we wanted. But it destroys the enemy sprite. It goes away, right? I don't want it to just destroy that enemy sprite though, because if the enemy runs into me, I also need to lose a life, right? I don't want to keep my 3 lives. So I want my value of my lives variable to decrease by 1 as well. So I'm going to go to variables, and I'm going to use that x equals. It's going to go in that conditional. And remember, make sure I'm using this one again, not var x equals. This is only used when you create that variable for the first time. Var means make a variable called this, right? So we already created our lives variable up here at the top. So if I were to use that again, it would produce some funky results that I wouldn't want. So I'm going to make sure we're not doing that. So I want the assignment, so lives is getting the value of the old value of lives minus 1. So lives minus 1. Okay, so we're going to test this. So when that enemy ship runs into me, it's going to get destroyed, and lives is going to decrease by 1. There you go. Now I can see my lives is equal to 2 now instead of 3. Perfect. All right. Now, if I want to here, I can also, I can spruce this up a little bit. So one way I could spruce it up is to add a sound. So I'm going to go, and to add a sound, it's going to be under world here. And it's right at the top, play sound. And I'm going to pick a sound to play. Search for explode. Not sure if you'll be able to hear this through Zoom, but you'll be able to, oop, that was pretty loud actually. You'll be able to test the samples here, see what they sound like. I'm going to go ahead and use that one. I think that one's good. Choose. Right, and that's all I have to do for the sound. Hit run. There we go. Enemy ship was destroyed. Lives decreased by 1. And it played the sound, the exploding sound. Okay. All right. So, I mean, that's pretty much it right now. Right now, I can, I might be able to dodge the enemy ship, and it keeps going. We'll look at doing wraparound probably next week. I think we'll include that in the next week's activity. We're going to add a little bit of a wraparound function, same way we did on the last one, right? So when something goes off the edge of the screen, it comes back around. But we'll get to that next week when we get into adding multiple enemies. But so far now, like the enemy can do damage to me, but I can't do damage. Well, I mean, if it runs into me, it explodes. But otherwise, I can't do damage to it, right? I can't shoot at it or anything. So that's the next part we're going to add, right? So this is kind of getting into part 2. So part 1 was adding an enemy, making it move, and adding the collision detection, which is, again, much simpler than how it was in App Lab. This is also set up for specifically to do stuff like that, right? Game Lab is kind of made for that. Now we're going to get into part 2, which is allowing our ship to be able to shoot. All right. Reset. So the first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to create the image for our blast, right? So we need like the thing that's actually going to come out of the ship, shoot out, right? Come on. So we're going to make that, and we're actually going to make this one from scratch, but we are going to have to go to animation to do it. So I'm going to go to animation, and I'm going to do a new animation. And I'm going to draw my own here. So draw your own. So we haven't really looked at any of these tools within the animation panel here. So we're not going to be doing too much with it today. There is a lot that we can do in here, but we are going to do something really simple. Okay. So first thing up, we have this whole big area to work with right now, and I can draw in here. I can see it's there's all these other tools I can use. I can change my color. Right. I can draw anything I want from scratch right here. I'm just going to undo, hitting the undo shortcut. If you don't know what that is, Control and Z together. Control Z is undo. So that's what I just did here to get rid of that. So we are just going to make a little tiny small blast that's all one color. Really simple. So we're not going to worry about, oh, Mr. G, I can't draw, especially not with the mouse. Don't worry. You're not going to have to draw. So right now, this is a pretty big space. Our blast, we want it really tiny. We could, if we wanted to, we could do scale instead, but we're actually going to resize this thing now to make it really small. So I'm going to go to resize. And when I do, I get up this resize window. There's a couple things I need to make sure are happening. So if I start, I can set my width and height here, but I need to make sure that this maintain aspect ratio is unchecked. Okay, if it is checked and I try to change this, if I change my width, it's going to change my height to be the same exact thing. So I'm going to make sure that's unchecked. And this resize canvas content can also, that one can remain checked. Okay. So make sure that's unchecked. I'm going to make my width My width is 5. I'm going to make the height a little bit longer, right? So I'm going to make this kind of like a rectangle. It's just a little blast that's going to come out. So I'm going to make my width 5 and my height 8. Make it a little bit taller than it is wide. And then I need to hit this resize button. Okay, so I'll make it 5 wide, 8 tall. If you end up making, you're doing it on your own, you're like, oops, I made it, a little bit bigger, a little bit whatever. Not a big deal, right? It's if you make it off by a couple pixels, it's not going to break anything. I'm here resize, and I get this much smaller area to work with. You can see even when I drag my pen tool over here, right? My pixels are displaying much larger. Okay. So I've resized my area to work with. Now I'm going to pick the color I want for my blast. And you can use whatever color you want. Doesn't matter, right? So make sure you're changing the slider over here on the side, but then also the picker in the middle. Because sometimes people have pick stuff over here, but they're the sliders, they're moving their slider, but the picker's still down here on the color black. And they're like, why is my color changing? It's like, that's why. You gotta make sure you actually pick the right color. All right, so let me see. My ship is green. I think I'm gonna use a red blast for mine. Red, I'm gonna find a color red I want. So I'm gonna do something kind of bright. Maybe a little, there we go, I like that. There we go, I'm gonna go with that color. Again, you can use any color you want, not important. All right, but you will want to make sure that the color picker down here has adjusted and is now the color that you had just selected. All right, so from this point, all I have to do is use one tool in here because I am going to fill in this whole area. So I'm going to use this paint bucket right here. Then all I have to do is click once, and it's going to fill in the entire canvas, my entire area here with that one color. And that's it. That's all I have to do in terms of creating something from scratch. The last thing I do want to do inside of animation before I go back, though, is rename this. Name it blast. And then I'm ready to go back into my code. So the undo shortcuts. I don't know where, do they have an undo tool in here? Nope, that's rotation. I actually don't think they give you an option to undo, but you can use the keyboard shortcut, which again, hold down the control key and then hit the letter Z. And you can do that multiple times, right? So if you hold down control and hit Z multiple times, it'll let you go undo multiple times. And that actually works in most programs. So it'll work in like Game Lab as well, or any part of code.org you can undo using that method too. Yeah, it's weird I don't see an undo like actual tool to click on though. Would have thought they would have given you that. All right. So I'm ready now to start adding in the code for my blast. And I'm going to start off the same way I started with my other sprites. So I'm going to go back up to the top, and I need to create that sprite, right? The same way I did my player, my enemy, my background. And I'm going to do it probably just for organizational sake, just above where my enemy setup is. I'll probably just put the code in right there. So I'm going to go to sprites, and I'm going to use var sprite equals. And I'm just going to call this blast. I'm going to come back to where I'm going to create it in a little bit. And then I need to make sure I set that animation. So I'm setting the blast.set animation to, I called my animation blast too, my image, right? My sprite. So I'm going to set it like that. All right, and it's going to create it at 200, 200. So it's going to show up in the middle of my screen. Okay, You know what? I'm gonna take that sound out for now because testing this, it's going to drive me nuts. Gonna keep making that loud noise. All right. I'm also not gonna require you to put the sounds in. That's gonna be optional. But I'm gonna take it out now for right now for testing. Otherwise, it's gonna keep exploding over and over. Okay. All right. So if I look right now, so I've created my my blast, and it's at 200, 200. So you can actually see it on my screen right here. Right. That's not where I want it to be created, or I don't even want it showing up right at the beginning, right? But now I can see it, I can test it, I can make sure, okay, my sprite is showing up, it's loading correctly. That's the first part I want to test. All right. So instead of it showing up though, like right in the middle of my screen, right as soon as the game starts, what I want to happen is that when I press the button that's going to be, I'm going to use for fire, which I'm going to use spacebar. When I use that button, I want that blast to show up at the front of my ship. Right, I want to show up right up here. Until that happens, I want my blast to be off screen somewhere. I don't want to even see it. I want it to be gone. So I'm going to actually set the initial coordinates for my blast to be off screen. I'm actually going to leave my my Y the same. That's fine. I'm going to set my X though. Right now it's at 200, which is the middle. Remember, my width is 400 for my game screen. So if I set it over here, way to the side, off like higher than 400, it'll just kind of be off on the edge, invisible to me and to anybody else. So I'm going to change my X here, and I'm going to set it to 450 just so it's got a little bit of extra space off to the side there. So now when I hit run, my blast is not showing up because it's over here, right? It's kind of off screen. All right. And now I'm ready to actually start working on the code that's going to allow me to actually shoot this thing. And I'm going to do this inside of another function. So I'm going to create a new function, again, just to help me organize my code a little bit. So I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom. I'm going to go to functions. I'm going to create a new function. Again, this one does not have an input, which is, again, a parameter is the coding term for it. I'm just going to use this new function. I'm dragging it all the way to the bottom. And I'm just going to call this one shoot. And just so I don't forget later, I'm going to go ahead and just put the code to call that function or to run the function right up here inside of draw now. And I'm going to put it right underneath enemies collide. Again, make sure it's inside of your draw function, or else it's not going to end up running. It's not going to do anything. Okay. All right, so I've got my function shoot. So what I want is when I press the space bar, right, the button I want to use to make shoot happen, I'm going to have that location of that blast move to be, I want it to be at the front of my ship. So I'm going to first add in that conditional that's going to control the movement itself, right? So if key down space, then move my blast. So I'm going to do control, and I'm going to use an if. And I'm just using a regular if, not an if else. And I want to do key down, which is under world. It's going to go into my if. Space. So you can see they do have a limited selection here, but like if you wanted to use the X key, I'm pretty sure you can just type in X, even though it's not available in the drop-down menu. Okay, so if key down space, then I want my X and my Y coordinate for that blast, which is currently off screen, to move. And the first way I'm going to set it is just to have it move exactly to where my player is. So I'm going to go to sprites, And I have sprite.x and sprite.y here. And I can actually just drag these right inside of my if statement. So I am going to make my blast.x be set to the same value as my player.x. And I'm going to do the same thing for my y. So I'm going to come in here and do blast.y. And I could, if you really want to, drag that over, but you can also type it in, right? So I can do player.y. All right, now we're going to see what this looks like. There's my enemy ship. Now when I hit the space bar, you can see that the blast image shows up right exactly where my ship is. Now it doesn't move with me. It doesn't, right now we haven't given it any velocity on the Y either, so it's not moving up, right? And it doesn't move back and forth. It will stay at that same point, but it's going to move it to the same exact place my ship is, right? And my X and Y, which again, that X and Y value is going to give me the dead center value of my image in GameLab. Okay, so what I want to do, my X is actually pretty good, right? Because I'm going to have this coming out of the front of my ship. So my X value is good because it's right in the middle. So that's actually where I want it on my X. My Y is a little off though, right? I need to move it a little bit up. And there's a way we can actually probably get where we want it using some simple math, right? So right now, remember, it's giving us dead center in the middle of the ship, right? So we want that blast to go up by half of the total height of the ship because it's in the middle. So we want to take half the height of the ship and subtract it from our Y value. So instead of having blast Y, getting the value of player.y, I'm going to drag player.y out. I'm actually going to type this whole thing in. If you really want to, you could go in and use math blocks to build this thing out. I'm going to type the whole thing in. So I'm going to do, instead of getting just player.y, I want to be player.y. That's right. So my Y value minus, because I want it to go up, which actually my Y value is minus, right, to go up half of the height. And I can do player dot heights divided by 2, right, because it's half the height. And if I typed it incorrectly, that player dot height will turn into like a red block like this. You again can also, if you really want to, drag multiple math blocks in here and drag in sprite.height. Otherwise, just make sure you don't make a typo. I think it's much easier to type stuff like this in than drag multiple blocks inside of each other and then make sure you're dragging each block into the right section of each thing. I find it much easier to just type in player.y minus player.height divided by 2. Let that get destroyed. Now I can see that blast is showing up just in front of the front of my ship. And it's still, every time I hit the space bar, it's still doing that. There we go. All right. So any questions yet before we throw anything else on here? Just check and make sure. Temperature check. Feeling good. Okay. Next thing is very simple. We're just going to add some velocity to our blast. Okay? And again, we're going to add velocity on our Y because we want it to change on that axis. And we want it to be moving up, which means we're actually going to be giving it a negative velocity on Y, right? Because we want it to get closer to 0. So I'm going to add sprite.velocity Y and just put this all inside of my if statement here. And do blast. Oop. blast, there we go, dot velocity y. And I'm going to give this, I'll do -10 to start us off at least here. Now when I shoot, my blast is moving down the screen. Now it's going to still probably work a little bit off. We're going to make some changes to this in a second here. Because you can see I can, if I hit spacebar over and over and over again, kind of keeps moving it back, right? It keeps moving it back to the front of the ship. Now we could leave this functioning this way if we wanted to, but we're not. We're going to make a change. And part of the reason we're going to make this change is so we can actually use a variable in a slightly different way than we have before, which is actually a good way of thinking about how you can use these variables, which is nothing that it's never really presented itself in a way that we need to use it in AppLab before. But especially if you get into game design, you'll use variables like this, I'm about to show you a lot. And that is just assigning a variable a true or false value. So we haven't actually told a variable to be true or false before. We've told it to have a number value or to have a string value. Strings, right, are stuff in quotes. But we've never actually told it to be true or false, right? And remember that true or false, the fancy term for that type of data is a Boolean, right? So true or false, it's a Boolean. So we're going to give it a Boolean value. So we're going to give it, what we want is right now, our blast is kind of just like going back to the ship over and over and over again. We want to not allow the ship to shoot again until after that blast has gone off the edge of the screen. And then once the blast has gone off to the edge of the screen, then we'll be able to shoot again, right? So one, it controls like how fast we can fire. And two, at least the way that we're building this right now, it's going to affect to make sure that we it isn't doing weird stuff with our blast where our blast keeps respawning at the front of our ship in a kind of a weird way. Okay, so first thing we need to do here is to set up our variable, and we're going to set it up at the very top. So I'm going to go back up to the top, underneath where I set up my blast. I'm going to go to variables, and remember I'm going to use var for this one because I'm creating a new variable. I'm going to do it right under where I set my animation for blast, and I'm going to call this variable can shoot. Can shoot. And when you're naming this, this again is a kind of a good rules to follow when naming your variables. Start with the lowercase letter, and if you have more than one word, you can capitalize those letters. But also remember, however you name it, you need to match that exact name, exact casing, everything, every time you use that variable. Okay, so if you use a lowercase s, and then you go down and you're looking at your variable later and you use a capital S, it's going to give you errors, right? Stuff's not going to work. So I'm going to do create a variable called can shoot, and I'm going to give it an initial value up here of true, right? So it means when the game starts, I will be able to shoot. And right now it is going to give me that warning because I haven't used it yet. It's okay. We're going to scroll down. We go back down to my shoot function here. And I'm actually going to change the condition, my conditional inside of my shoot function. So right now, it's when I press the space bar. I'm going to change this so that not only if I press the space bar, but also can shoot has to be true in order for my shooting to happen. So I need two things to be true. So I am going to use a math block here. And I'm going to use that and block, which is just two and symbols. Which the fancy term for is ampersands. There we go. Type that in there. My first condition, I'm just going to put back in key down space. So I go to world, key down, and key down space. But my second condition on my other side here, I'm going to type in So key down, if key down space and can shoot equals equals. Make sure you use two equal signs. Two equal signs is asking, are these two things equal? True. And true is a lowercase t, no quotation marks. If you put quotation marks or you add a capital, it will not work. Some coding languages use a capital T for true and false. Some of them use a lowercase. We're using lowercases here. Okay. All right, so now this, actually the way I have this set up here now, nothing will actually change at this exact moment, right? So if I keep doing this, it's still shooting over and over again. So what I need to do is after I shoot, right? So this is true, right? And then it moves my blast and it moves the velocity. After this happens, I need to set can shoot to false. So I go to variables and I do my assignment. Make sure I'm using assignment, not var x, right? I'm not creating a new variable. I'm giving it a new value. And I'm going to set can shoot to false now. And make sure you spell false right, because I almost just typed it in wrong. Can't shoot to false. Now what this does is when I shoot once, I try to shoot again. Right now, I can't shoot at all, again, after I shoot once, right? Because after I shoot once, this code runs. At the bottom here, can shoot gets set to false, which means this condition is not being met anymore. Because nothing is resetting that can shoot to true. Okay. Any questions at this point? We're good? All right. So now we need to have a condition that's going to actually allow us to shoot again. And we want that condition to be is when that blast goes off the edge of the screen. So what we want is when our Y value for our blast is less than 0, meaning it's off the top, then we're going to reset can shoot back to true. And we're going to do that using a brand new conditional. We're not doing an else if, right? It's not connected to this conditional. It's a separate condition to check, completely separate. So we're going to control, and I'm going to add an if statement. And if you want to, you could drag in a math block and drag in these blocks, but I'm going to type it in. And that is blast dot y is less than 0. So if blast dot y is less than 0. Then we're going to set can shoot back to true. So I'm going to use that assignment again. Make sure I'm not using var. Can shoot equals true. Reset my code and run it again. And now, once my blast goes off the edge of the screen, I can see I can shoot again. And there we go. I can shoot over and over and over again. All right. So we're almost all the way there. The last thing we need to add to this is, if we notice real fast here, if I can do this fast. If I try to shoot my enemy ship, the blast doesn't actually do anything to the enemy ship yet, right? It right? Doesn't do anything to the enemy ship. So what I want to do is I want to add in another condition that's going to detect if that blast is colliding with the enemy ship, and if so, destroy the enemy ship. So this is going to be very similar to how we did it for our detect if the player was colliding with the enemy. So I'm going to set a condition, and this is all again inside of my shoot function, and I'm going to drag that third condition now down to the bottom. Make sure it's not inside one of the other conditions. And I'm going to set this up again the same way that I set up the player and the enemy colliding, which was going to sprites and using the is touching. And I'm going to put that right inside of that condition to check, right inside of my if. And if blast, not bast, blast is touching enemy 1, I need a couple things to happen. First, I need my enemy to be destroyed. So I'm going to do enemy 1.destroy, same way I did before. But I also want to reset can shoot to true, right? Because my blast hit the ship, and I want to reset it to true so I can be able to shoot again. And shoot equals true. So you might have noticed something weird there happened for a second. And that's the one last thing we need to fix here. So if you watch carefully what happens, right? It's actually, the ship is getting destroyed when I test this now. But watch what happens if I try to shoot right again after the enemy ship is destroyed. It went back to doing that weird kind of, looks like it almost like it's glitching thing, right? Where it's moving back to the front of the ship, the blast is, right? So I do want can shoot to be equal to true. But before I shoot again, I kind of want that blast to kind of disappear off screen so it looks like it's coming out of the ship again. Like it's going to look like the enemy ship's here, the blast hits it, the blast disappears, the enemy ship disappears, and then if I shoot again, it's going to come back out of the ship. Okay, so that's what I want it to look like. Whereas right now it's kind of respawning that blast again, right? So what I'm going to do is actually move my blast off the edge of the screen like I did at the beginning when I first created it. So I'm going to go to sprites, and I'm going to set sprite.x. And I'm going to do this before can shoot equals true, although probably the timing wouldn't really affect it too much anyway. Enemy, not enemy. Nope, this is the blast. We're resetting the position of the blast. I'm going to set blast.x again off the edge of the screen. So I used 450 before, so I think that's a good number to use because, again, our screen is 400 wide. And then I might as well, I'm going to give it a y value too, just to give it a solid point to go to. And I'll keep it where it was before. So I'll do just 200, which will just put it in the middle. And then I'm also going to have it stop moving because maybe I fire right away this time, but then I wait a while before I fire again. I'm just going to turn its velocity to 0. Okay, so we're going to do velocity y and do blast dot velocity y equals 0. Okay. So it'll kind of, when this happens, if our blast hits the enemy ship, it's going to destroy the enemy ship. Then it's going to move our blast sprites off screen. It's going to be 450, so just off the edge of the screen here, and 200 y, so it'll be kind of like in the middle. And it's also going to make it stop moving, right? But it's also going to reset can true to shoot, or can shoot to true. Can shoot to true, which means once we add more enemies, it'll be able to shoot again at that point. So we're going to test this. Oops, I need to actually shoot at the enemy. That would help. So I shoot at the enemy, it destroys it. You can see my blast disappeared, and I can still shoot again. Okay. So there was a lot that went into our code today, right? So we added an enemy. So we got practice adding a sprite again, getting some practice doing the same stuff we did last week with that. We learned a little bit about how to do some collision detection in GameLab, specifically using this is touching command. And then we added our blast, right? So we learned how to use things a little bit differently. We learned how we can use a Boolean value, which is true or false, with just setting a variable straight to a Boolean value. And we can control things like when events happen, when we're allowed to shoot and when we're not allowed to shoot. And we learned a lot of differences between how we did stuff in AppLab versus how we do it in GameLab. Okay. Any questions before we go here? All right, so this is going to be the assignment. Next week, we are going to be going over these groups, which in coding terms, they use the term group. We're going to be talking about them also as something called an array, which is kind of a really important thing in coding that we haven't even brought up yet in discussion. We'll be talking about that and how to add multiple enemies using that, as well as using a different type of loop we haven't used before called a for loop, which can be a little bit confusing. So we're going to see how it goes. We might have to stretch it out to 2 weeks, actually, because that one can get a little tricky. Okay.